What if the most consequential military decision of the entire Western Front wasn't made in a war room, wasn't debated by generals over maps and coffee, but was instead forced, violently, urgently, almost personally, by one man's sheer refusal to accept the word no? What if the fate of thousands of soldiers, the momentum of an entire campaign, and the speed at which World War II ended in Europe all hinged on a single confrontation between two American commanders, one burning with ambition, the other paralyzed by caution, on a rain-soaked afternoon in the summer of 1944? That man was General George S. Patton, Jr., and the decision he forced upon General Omar N. Bradley would echo through history in ways neither man could fully predict in that moment. If this kind of deep, cinematic military history moves something inside you, then you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves real stories of leadership under fire, and drop a comment below telling us something you didn't know about Patton or Bradley before watching. Your engagement keeps this kind of storytelling alive, and there are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. By late July 1944, the Allied campaign in Normandy had become something that no one in London or Washington wanted to say out loud. A slow, grinding, costly stalemate. Since the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, American, British and Canadian forces had fought with extraordinary courage through the hedgerows of Normandy, the infamous bocage, a labyrinthine landscape of dense earthen walls, ancient hedges, and sunken lanes that neutralized Allied armor and turned every field into a killing ground. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, had expected a rapid breakout. Instead, his armies were bleeding for every kilometer. The press was growing impatient. Politicians in Washington were asking questions. And Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army from his tactical headquarters, was under enormous pressure to find a solution that didn't seem to exist. Bradley was a careful man. Born in Clark, Missouri on February 12, 1893, he had built his reputation on methodical planning, soldier welfare, and a studied reluctance to gamble with lives. His men called him the GI's General, a title he wore with genuine pride. He understood logistics, he respected the limits of supply lines, and he distrusted the kind of theatrical boldness that got men killed for the sake of headlines. But by the third week of July 1944, caution was not winning the war. The Allied front lines barely extended beyond what they had captured in the first days after June 6. Something had to break. Bradley knew it. Eisenhower knew it. And nobody knew it with greater ferocity than the man sitting in a command trailer not far away, waiting, scheming, and barely containing himself, General George S. Patton, Jr. Patton was everything Bradley was not, at least on the surface. Born in San Gabriel, California, on November 11, 1885, he had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of moment. He had studied war the way other men studied scripture. Obsessively, reverently, personally. He believed in speed above all else, in the psychological devastation of a rapidly moving front, in striking the enemy so fast and so hard that they never had time to recover their balance. He had proven it in North Africa and in Sicily, where his 7th Army had raced across the island in a campaign of breathtaking velocity. But in the summer of 1944, Patton was officially sidelined. Due to the infamous slapping incident of August 1943, in which he struck 2 shell-shocked soldiers in field hospitals in Sicily, Patton had been publicly humiliated, reprimanded by Eisenhower, and held back from command while lesser men, in his view, were given his rightful place in the fight. Patton's official assignment in the spring of 1944 had actually been deliberate theater. He commanded the fictitious 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, a phantom force designed to deceive the Germans into believing the real Allied invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The deception worked brilliantly. Even after June 6, Hitler held back his best panzer divisions waiting for the real attack that Patton would supposedly lead. But for Patton himself, playing a ghost was agony. He wrote in his diary with barely restrained fury, certain that history was moving without him, that glory was being spent by men who didn't understand how to use it. Then, in late July 1944, Eisenhower made the decision that changed everything. Patton would be given command of the newly activated U.S. Third Army, which would become operational on August 1, 1944. But before that date arrived, something extraordinary happened. Something that forced Bradley's hand in a way he had never anticipated and would never entirely forgive. Operation Cobra was Bradley's plan. His great gamble, conceived in desperation and executed with the full weight of Allied air power behind it. Beginning on July 25, 1944, American bombers delivered one of the most concentrated aerial bombardments in the history of warfare against a narrow section of the German line near Saint-Lô in Normandy. Nearly 2,500 aircraft dropped thousands of tons of bombs on a corridor barely 7 kilometers wide. The devastation was staggering, though tragically some bombs fell short, killing 111 American soldiers and wounding nearly 500 more, including the death of Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. But the German line, held by the battered remnants of Panzergruppe West and the 7th Army under Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, was shattered. A gap had opened. The question now was who would pour through it and how fast. Patton did not wait for official permission to become relevant. His Third Army was still technically days away from activation, but Patton began moving, talking, positioning, and most critically, pressuring. He appeared at Bradley's headquarters with a proposal so aggressive, so geometrically ambitious, that Bradley initially reacted with the instinctive caution that defined him. Patton wanted to send armored columns not just through the gap near Avranches, the hinge point where the Allied front bent toward Brittany, but sweeping in a vast arc southward, then eastward, then north, encircling the entire German Army Group B in what would become one of the greatest encirclement operations ever attempted. Bradley hesitated. The supply lines were dangerously thin. The flanks would be exposed. The risk was, by any conventional military calculus, enormous. But Patton didn't argue with Bradley, he demonstrated. He showed Bradley what was already happening on the ground, what his forward units were reporting, what the German collapse looked like in real time. It was in this atmosphere of urgency, opportunity, and institutional friction that Patton forced Bradley into the decision. On July 31, 1944, just one day before the Third Army officially came into existence, Patton's forces, operating under a kind of authorized ambiguity, had already crossed the Sea River and were pushing through Avranches. The German defenses were not merely broken, they were dissolving. Patton personally drove to the front, coordinating movements, shouting over radio communications, physically positioning himself where the action was thickest. He called Bradley repeatedly, not to ask permission but to report momentum, to confront him with a reality that demanded a response. Bradley, faced with maps showing American armor pouring through gaps the Germans couldn't close, found himself in a position where caution had become the greater risk. To hold Patton back now would be to surrender a historic opportunity. And Bradley knew it. Here, at the very hinge of this incredible story, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please do it right now, and like this video, share it with a friend who loves history, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most so far. Your support is what makes it possible to keep bringing these forgotten moments of human drama and historical consequence back to life with the depth and detail they deserve. The decision Bradley made, reluctantly, under pressure, but ultimately with the recognition that history demanded it, was to unleash Patton fully. The Third Army was authorized to exploit the breakout in all directions simultaneously. What followed was one of the most spectacular campaigns in American military history. In just 2 weeks, Patton's armor covered more ground than the entire Allied force had gained in the 7 weeks since D-Day. By August 13, 1944, Third Army units were approaching Argenton from the south while British and Canadian forces pressed down from the north, threatening to close a massive pocket around the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army near Falaise. Inside that pocket were somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 German soldiers. The Falaise pocket, as it came to be known, became one of the decisive engagements of the Western Front, and it was born directly from Patton's refusal to let Bradley settle for less than everything. The relationship between Patton and Bradley never fully recovered from the tensions of that summer, and history has spent decades debating who deserves more credit for what became known as the Great Crusade's finest hour in France. Bradley, in his post-war memoir, A Soldier's Story, acknowledged the brilliance of the breakout while carefully preserving his own role as its architect. Patton, who died on December 21, 1945, following injuries sustained in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany, never stopped believing that he had been consistently restrained by timid men who didn't understand the nature of war. Eisenhower, navigating between both men with the diplomatic agility that made him a future president, credited the breakout to the collective effort of Allied command, a verdict that satisfied no one entirely and perhaps captured the truth better than any individual claim. What is certain, beyond all argument, is that on those blazing, chaotic days of late July and early August 1944, one man's absolute refusal to accept institutional hesitation changed the course of the war in Western Europe. If you made it to the end of this story, then you already know that history is never made by the cautious alone. It is made in the collision between ambition and restraint, between the man who sees what is possible and the man who must answer for what goes wrong. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss another story like this one. Like this video if Patton's relentless drive gave you even a fraction of the chills it deserves, share it with someone in your life who needs to understand what real leadership under impossible pressure looks like, and leave a comment below telling us, what did you learn today that you had never known before? The stories of the men who changed the world are waiting, and this channel will keep telling them, one extraordinary moment at a time.